Gonna ask that. Okay. Well, I guess we could go ahead and slowly get started here. Welcome everybody. I was just saying that as apropos, my kid has started middle school this year, so I'm learning how to go a little slower, take everything one step at a time, and just get all the different bus routes and lockers and everything figured out. So bear with me a minute here. Well, welcome everybody. It's been a little bit of time since we've seen you. We last saw you a couple months ago, maybe a month and a half ago, and we're excited to join you in our fifth TAC meeting. Welcome back. And I know we also have some folks can't make it, but we're recording, so you can always catch up. And we appreciate those of you who are able to make the time. So today we're going to dive really into our main event, which is walking you through our approach to the Walkable Design Standards Guidebook. So we'll be sharing two larger pieces with you, which is both our compliance process that we've laid out, walking you through that, and then stopping for a moment to discuss that, answer questions, get your feedback. And then we'll also be walking through what is in the guidebook itself. So orient you to the tools and resources you'll have, how it'll be structured, give you a chance to peek under the hood. And again, we'll stop and have a discussion there, get your questions, hear any thoughts you have, so we can incorporate that into a draft and a refined draft after that. And then I'll leave you with a sense of where are we going next? What are our next steps? You've got one homework assignment, and so we'll lay all that out for you. So again, we've covered a large amount of ground in this project, and honestly, some of that has to do with CFEC itself. Very large, broad topic area, and in trying to get focused with what specifically is 0330 looking at. We've had broad-ranging discussions with you all, so we've really established what's the scale and the applicable area for CFEC-related updates that you need to make. We've gone through what's the intent and what are the priority topics or what are the relevant standards. We spent a lot of time walking through with you all what are the existing ways that jurisdictions handle these standards, what are approaches, what are the types of standards, what's the range of values within those standards. And then we've also brought more information to the table. So what are some best practices, ways that other jurisdictions have looked at approaches also meeting those CFEC goals. So what are some new ideas to think through and bring to the table? Most recently, we broadened our input by reaching out to stakeholders. We haven't had a chance to walk you all through that, but today Tara from our team is going to share with you when we reached out to stakeholders or people that use the code actually, what was their input in terms of some of the barriers now that they see often in codes to CFEC goals of compact, walkable places? And then what are some consequences we need to think through so that we're not accidentally setting some barriers up in any new code that's adopted? And then lastly, we provided you with, we emailed out last week, draft model code language and draft compact building types. So rubber's starting to hit the road here, and we're going to shift from these broad-ranging discussions into really pinning down how do you comply and what are the tools that you're going to have to figure that out. So to orient you all, we're going to use these terms a lot today, and we're going to move through them slowly one by one, but just to give you a bigger sense of what's going to be in the Walkable Design Standards Guidebook. It's going to be one guidebook that is going to compile a series of resources and tools for you. There's going to be four kind of key components or tools, if you will, that you got to bring to the table. And so there's going to be an overview of CFEC. There's a lot of different parts of this program and policies. And so more specifically, what is the role of 0330 within that? What are the other parts of CFEC? And just sort of orient people to what it is that they need to know. And also really establish the baseline and make sure we're all on the same page around that. Then you've got a series of standards, which are organized around priority topics. And for those standards, there's going to be model code language. There's going to be some additional guidance and key considerations and information for you to consider. And then those best practices, new ideas. There's also going to be building types, which is that menu of compact development types. And that's another tool that you have to look at and think through in terms of compact development outcomes. And lastly, there's additional resources. You know, CFEC touches many different areas. Now, we're focused on the land use regulations, but land use planning is more complex than that. There's where the public realm touches things. There's questions around utilities or streets. There's concerns around TSP or parking. And so we want to have sort of a catch-all at the back of the guidebook, which links you to all the resources that DLCD is currently in the middle of developing or has previously developed. So all the resources, every tool that you could need is packed up into your toolkit here in your Walkable Design Standards Guidebook. So we're going to present information today, and I just like to pose up front what are the questions we're going to ask you to think about. So I'm going to ask you to park these sort of in the back of your mind, keep these in mind as we walk you through the information today. So first is, do you understand the process of how to comply with 0330 using the Walkable Design Standards Guidebook? And then secondly, do the different resources that are included in the guidebook set you up for success in reviewing and updating your codes for compliance? So keep those two questions in mind, and I'm going to turn it over to Alex. And Alex, more than happy to keep sharing my screen if you'd like me to while you walk through this section.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Pauline. I get to help us take a little trip down the yellow brick road of compliance. So what does it mean to comply with the rules related to walkable design standards? Keep moving. So there's this pathway we've defined out, a process really. It's a 6-step process. It's sort of like when you open up an IKEA box, you get a set of instructions that are intended to be pretty accessible and pretty easy to follow. You've got all the tools also included. That's the guidebook, but this is how you're going to approach this work generally, or in a recommended way. So step 1 is gather. Step 2 is flag. Step 3 is assess. Step 4 is consider. Step 5 is solicit. And step 6 is prepare. So let's talk a little bit about how we set ourselves up, how we gather the information to start. Next slide. So as you all are familiar, we've organized the standards that are required to be assessed into 3 topic areas: pedestrian-oriented development, connectivity and access, compact development. The guidebook, conveniently enough, is also organized in these 3 main sections. Drilling down into each of those topics, you'll want to find where you have the related standards to each of these topics. So building orientation and frontage, street connectivity. So this is you gathering your information of your existing conditions. This is what you're going to be assessing. Next. Then you flag. So with the process of going through that information, you consultants, the staff, going through the information and flagging the code standards that are specific to walkability. And there's a number of them. But sort of this is an iterative process to hone in on the areas that you actually need to evaluate. For the purpose of the guidebook, since we're not designing zone-based recommendations for the dozens of that exist for all the communities that have to comply with these rules, we're using place types as a proxy for that information. So there are place types, zone districts that have the intent of creating certain types of outcomes. Those represent the guidebook as place types. So for place types that are related to neighborhood infill or Main Street type of an environment, the code topics that you need to gather and that are relevant are called out here. So some of them are relevant and applicable. Some of them are not, and some of them are applicable to most uses within these place types. So we've sort of given you the consumer report cheat sheet for how to go about flagging once you've gathered, flagging the standards you're going to want to assess. Next. This just helps you understand what we mean by place types. We can talk about this more, but this place types are a proxy for zone districts. too many zone districts to design bespoke standards for the guidebook. So the place type stand in for what the intent of the zone district is. So it's an effort of cross-referencing. Is my high density residential, is it that's a standalone residential district? Maybe it has front end access standards, place type. Street in a bigger community might really be more of a neighborhood scale, but a main street in a smaller community might be more downtown scale. So that's a little bit of local context will help you pick the right place type. So assess. So you've gathered, you've flagged, you've isolated your focus to those standards. Now you're going to assess. You're going to determine which of those standards do you have the standard, right? Do you have the standard that helps you achieve walkability? Yes, no. And then if you do, or if you want to edit into a particular zone to achieve walkability, you need to assess the intent of each of those standards and decide how you go about them. So in the guidebook, there's an intent for each of these topic areas. It helps you understand what the goal of each of these standards is to achieve. And you can reflect on that in terms of the standards you have or you'd like to add walkability. Then there's considering. So there's a variety of ways to go about achieving walkability from standards perspective. From zone to zone, from an outlying area of the city to a downtown corner, different for use types. So you have to consider options both in terms of how all of the guiding principles that we've used through this process are a helpful set of filters to help you consider different options. And then step 5 is really related to that. So there's you're considering options, but you want to solicit input from impacted communities and stakeholders in that process as well. Let's go to step 5. Great. So there's some specific guidance around how to solicit input, and it's helpful to remember that this is the Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities program, and so as we consider soliciting input, we want to make sure that we're considering soliciting input in an equitable way, and there's some helpful guidance around that will appear in the guidebook. So once you've considered and solicited and gone through that feedback loop and you're feeling pretty comfortable about where you're landing in terms of achieving the required walkability on these standards, then comes the write it up phase. That's the preparing recommended zone changes for adoption. So you may find that you've got some gaps in certain zone districts, certain standards maybe weren't present that you want to add, or certain standards were present, but they need to be calibrated a bit to achieve more walkable outcomes. That's what this step is all about, writing it up. Once you've gone through this critical thinking exercise, you just do a quick checklist of, did you achieve all of the steps, and can you demonstrate that in findings? And if you have had a critical thinking process that looks something like this, then you're good. So it sounds simple, 6 simple steps. I know that the devil's in the details, but hopefully the intention of the guidebook is to help you navigate a process or provide you with a framework of a process, and you can make it your own based on your own approaches to evaluating zoning at the local level as well.
And if I could just jump in, Alex, I think, for jurisdictions that have gone through, let's say, the recent House Bill 2001 updates, this is a very different process. There's a lot more flexibility, and DLCD has a desire to give jurisdictions the latitude to respond to their local conditions and to incrementally move their codes forward. So it really is that critical thinking process of trying to meet the intent and trying to move forward, and making sure you're moving in generally the right direction with this guidebook of the places to look within your code and the types of things to look for. So with that, I'm going to shift us over to discussion. And going to try to capture some of our thoughts here, and hopefully Alex and Tara, you can help me call on people and move this along. But just diving in here, looking in terms of compliance, when you look at the compliance process that we've laid out, are there any parts of it that are giving you pause? Is there something that's feeling maybe challenging, and why would that be? Or anything that's feeling like that's doable? Yeah, I think we could, that's a good tool for us. We could easily move through that compliance process. So anybody want to jump in with some initial thoughts on looking at that compliance process? And if it's helpful, I can bring up and shift actually back to the compliance diagram itself, so you could see all the steps laid out. Does this seem, are there steps that seem daunting?
Steps that need to be clarified further in terms of what's involved in them.
Steve, go ahead.
We're simultaneously engaged with a consultant under a grant to start this work as well. So we have a little bit, maybe more familiarity, I think, with the process and what it is going to look like. I think that maybe just a little bit more explanation around the conducting equity-focused engagement might be helpful.
Yeah, I think there's several different parts to this, and there's other parts of the OERs that are relevant here. And I think also DLCD is working to develop some guidance through some other projects around equity and outreach. And maybe, Cody, if I could ask you to provide some background on that, that could be helpful here.
Yeah, and just for the sake of time, I probably won't go into the details, but I think it's a great note, and we've gotten lots of that type of question. And so, as Pauline said, we have a project ongoing that should be coming out in the next month or two to do an equity engagement toolkit, which will include some of the CFEC equity requirements in there. So I think that we'll have some resources there, and we could, follow back if some of that doesn't answer the specific questions, but I think that we can work on this tool, kind of giving some brief guidance on what does that mean for the equity engagement focused outreach.
And I just say that sounds like a great idea, so thank you for that.
Okay, thank you.
The guidebook will just include some of the guidance like is shown here about the sort of best practices around how you go about having a solicitation process that's described here, but an engagement process around code options that is equitable. But there's more resources that will be on the horizon here.
Yeah, and one just quick comment. I know there's another hand raised, but just I think one thing that we're like a little concerned about, because we've been doing this with a lot of different things. We have our like House Bill 4006 rent burden community event coming up. We've been doing a lot of this. Is like, I think there's a little bit of concern of like equity outreach fatigue. Like our equitable populations and equitable groups are feeling like this is a lot. And so I think we're going to learn as we develop this and as we go and as we get feedback from it. But I'll just share that that's some of like the initial feedback that we're getting that like from some of our groups.
Yeah, that's come up, I think, increasingly. Sorry, if I could just jump in really quick, because we do a lot of engagement around work as consultants, and have experienced some of that feedback as well. And there's no easy solution, but one of the strategies that, in my opinion, I think in the opinion of some of our team who do this work, is that if there are opportunities to establish and even fund long-term relationships with a group of members in the community, so that there's not this sort of mobilize for a project go away, mobilize for a project go away, but there's a little bit more of a formal, funded, and long-term set of relationships with key stakeholders and key stakeholder group representatives in the community, kind of institutionalize that feedback loop over a longer period of time. That takes a commitment. It takes money. I'm not saying that it's easy, but some of the fatigue also comes with the sort of mobilization and then disengaging mobilization. So.
Thanks, Alex. Sarli, I know you'd raised your hand next. Go ahead.
Hey, so first of all, my response to the fatigue is what you said, but also to do all of your outreach at the same time. Have one set. If you know that you're going to be doing, say, if you know that you're doing 6 different projects for the city, do all of the outreach for the 6 different projects at the same time. Sometimes they fit really nicely, sometimes they don't, but you can usually get it. One, you go to the community rather than having them come to you, but also just ask them questions about fast ranging things. And that can help with that somewhat when you know what's coming up. You don't always know what's coming up. Something that I think the framework is great. But something that I was wondering is, are you going to have some like examples in here? So for example, on this equity and outreach, are you going to have places where you know, like here's a case study from blah blah, or here's how they did it here. So it's like 7 different things. I think that would be really helpful for communities that don't do this a lot.
There's case studies that will appear in the guidebook related to different approaches to the walkable standards and how other communities have resolved, and approached the walkable design standards stuff. But in terms of best practices around process, that's not currently contemplated in this guidebook. And I think, Cody and DLTD sounds like are sort of aware that there's some additional resources needed at the local level. And
yeah, I'll just add that's a little out of scope with what we were kind of intending to produce here. Was more just of a model code, and it kind of grew a little bit to more of the wraparound resources that you need to think about with the model code, which we really we like that concept. But because the agency is delivering this equitable engagement toolkit, and we're doing it in conjunction with our housing team, so we're kind of thinking of it as more holistic, as you say, Sarli, kind of not just targeting little specific things when you're reaching out, is a really good idea. So I think that we will be pointing over to existing resources for more of that process stuff in the guidebook, and kind of introducing when to apply that, but not including the full how to apply those resources within this guidebook.
Ollie, maybe we could zoom out just to the process diagram again and make sure there's not any other steps that need any sort of further clarification or, experience that folks have had going through similar steps in the past and want to sort of share some observations, hiccups, wins, et cetera. And I see a hand up.
I was just wondering, so we're one of the lucky communities that has consultant help when we apply this, and I appreciate the flexibility and kind of how we apply 330 in all of our jurisdictions. I was just wondering if there's going to be some sort of crosswalk between the different subsections and the guidebook or the model code, so it's easy to kind of see, like, oh, when we say this in 330, look at these sections, like kind of a quick guide, because I can anticipate, if you didn't have consultant help or you are starting from scratch, or I don't know, it'd just be useful.
Are you talking about specifically those sections of the rules? Just want to clarify the question.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Eunice. some of the challenge there lies in the rules. Sort of the standards go across many different rules, right? And there's not, in having tried that exercise to draw the straight lines between them, you could have one rule that touches on many different places. And so I think our overall approach was the intent and the model code language for each of the relevant standards that we present. If you look through each one of those, that's you have in essence complied and looked at each and individual part of the OARs. But Cody, I would ask you to jump in and confirm that that in fact would be sufficient.
I mean, I think so, but I want to make sure that the folks that are going to be using the product get what they need. So I really will lean to this group to help inform us.
Our intent as a team was to make the topic areas, which are sort of the highest level, the 3 topic areas we talked about, and then the standards that nest under those, speak to every aspect of 0330. So, you know, you can sort of grade us on how well you think we did there, but that was our intent. So if you sort of go through the guidebook and you address those topics and you address the standards that reside in them, our intention is that means that you are hunky-dory in the eyes of 033 or O.
And conversely, I guess, you know, if you see a part of 0330 that you don't think is reflected in this guidebook, please let us know. This is our first iteration here, and that's the kind of feedback that would really help us.
And just to maybe, I want to underline that if I could. I'm sorry, Pauline. So some of the feedback that we have received throughout the course of this project relates to things like street standards and street dimensions and things like that. The part of the public realm that interfaces with the part of the private realm that we're talking about. And that's incredibly important, incredibly useful feedback, but it's just, this is a land use exercise. So just want to make sure we keep everyone's eyes focused on the land use components of walkability. We understand that it's, you know, land use is the other side of the walkability coin with transportation, but this is the land use effort. And so to the extent that there are, you know, gaps or clarifications in the land use, it kind of brings back to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to thank Kevin. That's a great point. You know, we want to make sure as you're looking at it, if there are sections of 0330 that seem to be silent on, or that you're feeling you don't have sufficient direction on, that would be really helpful feedback for us. And, you know, we will have caveats and explaining, you know, there's certain portions. So for example, Eunice, you know this, but the low car district portion of 0330 is not something that we'll be providing guidance on. So we'll make sure to be very clear upfront in the guidebook, which are the sections of the rules that you can find information in the guidebook for, and which areas you cannot. But yeah, I would appreciate that detailed read through. You know, as people that essentially have to walk your communities through this process, we want to make sure that you have the resources that you need to do that in the most effective and easy way that we can provide.
Sounds good.
Does anybody else have any other clarifications or reflections on this process?
Just noting also that we're capturing the comments in the chat, even though we love them if they're said out loud, but we are capturing them.
Great.
Okay. Well, I think there'll be some time to kind of process this and provide feedback after this meeting as well. Just wanted to kind of try and capture anything that was obvious regarding the process and steps themselves. Feels like we're pretty good to move on. What do you think, Pauline?
Yeah, sounds good. And I think also as we move into the next portion and start looking at the tools you actually have in hand, you might have some additional thoughts. So when at the end we're talking about our specific resources and the guidebook itself. If you want to come back to the process, please, by all means, let's continue that as our discussion. So we want to walk you through the Walkable Design Standards Guidebook itself, so you have a sense of what's going to come across your desk or through your email. So how will it be structured? What will the different parts of it be? And give you a chance to peek under the hood, and also to maybe if we need to add an additional part as you look at under the hood. So again, here's those 4 parts that you're going to see and contained within the Walkable Design Standards Guidebook. These are the tools and the resources that you have to use as you go through the critical thinking compliance process, as we just laid out. So let's look at them in a little bit more detail. So here's the table of contents of the Walkable Standards Guidebook. So you have understanding where are these different tools and resources actually going to land. So first and foremost, you're going to open, there's a user guide, which explains the overview in that process. And then there's an introduction with more background on CFEC. So I'll go into each one of these in more depth, but just to give you the 10,000 foot overview. Then there's 3 chapters of the guidebook, and those are going to be focused on those priority topics. And those are the priority topics that we've really focused in on based on our discussion with you and our review of standards and our review of 0330. So it's 3 broad categories, and there's different standards contained within those priority topics. And then the building types are in specifically that chapter 3. And then there's that set of additional resources in the back. And so, yeah, to your point, Eunice, we'll definitely include the 0330 in here as well. So you've got this one-stop shop, everything that you could need in this resource. So let's walk through each section a little more slowly and give you a chance to reflect on how we could structure it to best help you. So we want to start first and foremost opening this with the tools that you need as a user, because you're required to go through this compliance process. You want to understand how to do it, and you want to just start upfront knowing, what do I have to do? So we're going to open with that, how to use the guidebook. What are the parts of it? Orient you to your tools, walk you through that process that we just described for assessing compliance, flag right away those standards that you're going to want to look at to assess, and then summarize and provide a table of contents, if you will, a summary of the recommendations for different standards. And that way you can, if you want to, go to one specific standard very easily. You can also look across all the standards and get a big picture look. So I want to have really a user-centered way to very quickly get a sense of what do you have to do and how are you going to go about it. After that, there's a more robust section describing CFEC. So CFEC has many, many different parts, as you all know, and we're focusing specifically on the land use regulation aspect, but there's confusion around the other parts and how they're all related. That's something we struggled with early on in this process. And so we want to make it clear and easy for people so that everybody starts on the same page. So, making reference to the TSP aspects and the housing and climate aspects, also CFAs, right? How we had this question early on of how is this 0330 regulations compared to CFAs? Now, every jurisdiction will be coming in at a different point, right? Some will already be, through scoping and they have consultants helping them. Other people need to know more information. So this is to share a common understanding with everybody as they start in on this guidebook. Also, we'll be really clear on what is addressed and what is not. So to Alex's point, this is looking at land use. This is looking on private land. This is looking at new development or redevelopment of a certain scale. And also making clear which areas within a jurisdiction need to be looked at. So then the chapters themselves. There's 2 chapters that have one set of tools, and I'm going to walk through what each of those are, and then a 3rd chapter on compact development, which has a slightly different set of tools. So within chapters 1 and 2, for each standard that's relevant, there'll be climate impacts, an intent statement, key considerations to think through, model code language, a set of annotated images, and then some of those best practices, things to think about. So compact development has a different set of tools, and you saw we shared with you our draft set of compact building types. This is different for a couple reasons. So first of all, there's a broad range of zones across all the jurisdictions that are required to comply with 0330. And it was too challenging to create what is that range of development standards that could work across all these different zones in all these different places. So instead, what we've provided is sort of a yardstick of what are some compact building types that are desired outcomes, and you can use that to compare and contrast with your existing development standards. Now, I want to take a second to look at a couple of these in closer detail, and just give me a moment to make sure that you're seeing this in full screen. So what do these chapters look like? When you have a relevant standard within a chapter, what is the information that you're going to see? So we want to make sure that we're oriented to the model code and our table of contents. There's always going to be a number that orients you. Then there's the title of the actual standard. So we have a list of climate benefits. We wanted to really front and center, we often talk about the urban design or the land use aspects, but fundamentally, this is changes to land use regulations to support and improve those climate outcomes. And so we wanted to highlight right here up front for each of these standards, what are the types of benefits that a jurisdiction could expect to see as they change their standards and as future development and redevelopment comes along that's compliant with this standard. So we want to put that front and center as a resource for you all. Now we have an intent statement, and this is a bigger picture goal. It's an encapsulation of what is the big idea here? What is the intent of this specific standard? How do you want to think about this standard vis-a-vis CFEC goals and 0330 rules? And this is capturing for you, this is a way for you to look at your existing standards and to say, is my standard meeting this intent? Is my standard advancing this intent? And it's a good sounding board to look at against your current code and to see, do I need this standard? Do I have a standard already in place that's meeting this intent? Do I need to go a little bit further with a standard I already have or apply it more broadly to more zones? And then to help you with that, along with the intent, there's this model code language that's been provided. Now, the model code language is represents one way that you could comply with 0330. It's not the only way. Really, it's a way in using code to compare apples to apples. So here's the model code language. Here's my existing code language. And now I'm comparing apples to apples. What are the considerations? What are the different parts? And you can look through those details and compare it against your code to get a sense as a benchmark of how maybe you could go further, or maybe you're already complying in ways with 0330. I do want to highlight, so the model code we've structured to match the format of the small cities model code. And we've used it as a tool so that it would be very easy to amend and to modify to place in your own code. And so one of those is, you'll notice there's these brackets, and we'll highlight for you, let's say there'll be maybe a range that you can choose from, but we want to provide a range of what we think is the right range. If you go within anywhere within that range, we think you're in good shape, but we want to provide those options for you. Also, you'll see in bracket references to existing other parts of code to make sure that you're already building in and thinking about those cross references so that they're all accurate. So additionally, we want to provide key considerations. So code is something that we have to think very, very deeply and hard about. It's very complex. And as you're seeking to adapt this model code language to your local context, we want to pose for you some questions and give you a starting point. So what are the types of things to think about in terms of applicability for this particular standard? Are there ways that you could maybe go a little bit further? Or if you're a jurisdiction that is trying to move the needle further and you're not ready to go as far as some places, what are some things you could think through? So this is a section to really help you as the users of this document think through the ins and outs, so you don't have to be doing that work on your own. Also, as Steve mentioned, and Eunice, as jurisdictions are able to hire consultants, if that's an available option, these are considerations that they can use to do and that analysis hand in hand with you. Last but not least, this is fundamentally about changing places. And so we want to have photographs that capture those built outcomes that show the do's and the don'ts of what does this look like when it actually hits the ground and it is looking different. And so those will be annotated images to help you really visualize and understand, and also to communicate this as you need to going forward. So that's what we'll be seeing for each of the relevant standards as a resource to help you walk through that critical thinking exercise. And then Alex, I'm going to let you walk through what they'll see in the compact building types in chapter 3.
Great. So as Pauline mentioned, this chapter 3 relates to the topic of compact development. And, these are the standards that I think a lot of us are pretty familiar with on a daily basis: height, setbacks, etc. All of the many, many dials that together influence compactness, or in a lot of cases, not compactness. And a couple of the way that we wanted to approach this was to provide a resource menu of different building types. And these building types are shaped not necessarily by a local jurisdiction zoning standards, but they are shaped by other factors that oftentimes are not really on the radar, as planners are not necessarily as aware of the other factors that influence compactness. So in communities or neighborhoods where there's been a relaxation of zoning standards, how does the market typically respond when there's a market demand for housing in particular? Well, things like building code, things like the relationship between, sort of right sizing parking and how parking is incorporated into the site and into the physical building itself or the site, how unit sizes, excuse me, and how building codes influence the shape of buildings. Those factors are important, and they sort of lay out a set of typical building typologies at various scales, and in communities around the state where the market has responded and delivered different flavors of compactness, they start to take on some similarities from typology to typology. And so this is a resource where, as you're evaluating a particular zone district and you are reflecting on the either the existing or the new and improved intent statement of that zone district, what is it trying to achieve? What types of buildings is it trying to achieve? You can say, okay, this zone district is really trying to achieve this kind of building type. Okay, let me go cross-reference my handy-dandy building type menu and see what a compact building form for that zone district might look like. And then, oh, by the way, if you look down in the built outcomes, which is in the lower right of the left-hand side of the page there, spread. Those are, they look a lot like zone standards, but they're actually the outputs, the outcomes of development. So what does this building look like in numbers? Right, the building massing on the left and the building examples on the right. If I looked at those through numbers, what does it look like? What's the typical, on a small site, how would that perform in terms of the type, density, the fair, etc. So it's not meant to be to tell you what to include, in terms of a standard or how to calibrate a standard. It's meant to be a reference point. So it's lined up with a spectrum of buildings that are hopefully a reference point to allow you to do that calibration step. Kevin.
Great.
Just want to maybe offer a little bit of clarification here. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the intent, we've got a number of different building types here. I think for some folks from smaller cities, they might look at this and say, well, that doesn't look anything like my downtown. And I don't think this code is intended to say you need to have one of these, well, at least one of these in each of your cities. We're not saying that. We're saying here's a menu of different contexts. Some are highly urban, some are on a more moderate urban scale. So, you know, pick from this the ones that make the best sense for your community. You know, and I'll just say, as somebody who's worked a lot with CFAs, you might look at your CFA standards in reference. Typically, that's going to be your most intensive area. If what you're seeing here doesn't really line up with that, then, you know, adjust those numbers accordingly.
Yeah, it's a great point, Kevin. Like I said, it's not meant to be directive at all. It's meant to show sort of the break points in different scales of buildings and different between mixed use and single use residential buildings at different intensity levels.
Yeah, and I'll just say, I don't, you know, don't let it discourage you from being aspirational too. I mean, if there you have some sense that the market may be moving this direction, we wouldn't want to discourage you from doing that. But, you know, what makes sense for your community is important.
Absolutely. And, you know, we're showing the sort of yellow brick road of compliance as a linear process, but we all know that there are iterative relationships between those steps. So as you solicit input from folks in the community who engage with the code, the standards, the folks in the design professions, folks in the building community, folks on the ground, you know, you'll learn what they think is feasible or could be feasible within the time horizon of zoning codes. You know, zoning codes don't get updated every day, so you want to build in some resilience into these standards. And if they think that that's on the horizon, you know, this kind of compactness in certain parts of town, like Kevin said, you might want to kind of preemptively address that. So as the market conditions change, the market can respond, and you won't have to do it again.
And I think to that point of the market, sort of a slightly a sidebar here, but we wanted to provide you with some of the additional information we've gotten from our stakeholders that is bolstering the resources that we're providing you. So we shared with you that we're going to do this outreach, but we haven't walked you through yet how we conducted it and who we heard from. But we also, this will be built in throughout the resource. So I want to give Tara from our team a chance to just walk you through that all, and then we can stop and go back and talk through the resources and answer any questions or hear feedback that you all have. So Tara, go for it.
Yeah, thanks, Pauline. As we've talked about today, and all of the content of the guidebook that we've shown you and all of the resources that we've shared with you thus far have been based on feedback that we've received from you all in these meetings and in your survey responses, our best practice research, and then we've also conducted this additional outreach that we've weaved into our materials as well. And so we wanted to get some feedback from stakeholders that have particular stake in the game when it comes to being the users of the actual code that gets written and having to make certain projects work out based on what the outcome of the code is. And so we reached out to some urban designers, builders, developers, architects, etc. We reached out to 13 people across the state, and we received 8 responses. And so we wanted to make sure that we captured both as administrators of the code, does this make sense? And then also users of the code, does this make sense? And so we asked them about significant barriers to designing or developing walkable compact development. And then we also solicited some feedback on our concepts that we've shared with you guys on frontage, connectivity, density, and landscaping. And if you go to the next slide, when we asked them about the most significant barriers when trying to develop or design walkable compact development, the 3 top answers were maximum density, active ground floor retail requirements, and maximum height. And so everything that you see on this list, except for frontage requirements, guidance on that based on these responses is going to be included in that chapter 3 of the guidebook for compact development. And then I starred frontage requirements because we had a response that included that as a barrier, which kind of validated us having that particular concept included in the guidebook, where we will be providing some best practice research about how we can be a little more flexible on those requirements. Next slide. I would say that the overall takeaway from what we heard from these stakeholders is that none of our respondents had any major issues with what concepts we were proposing. Nobody said, oh, this is going to cause, a ton of problems for development. And so most of it was very validating of what the TAC has discussed, and they agreed that there can be better ways to approach these particular concepts of frontage, connectivity, density, and landscaping. And so they agreed that flexibility is important for frontage to get more organic and varied feel along the street, but to allow developers to meet frontage requirements in various ways that make sense for the context of their particular site. They agreed that pedestrian connectivity creates human scale development, but they brought up that some nuances, like the design of those connections, is particularly important. They highlighted the importance of form-based standards instead of density, that can have better outcomes for jurisdictional goals. And then again, highlighting that they agreed with adding some flexibility for landscaping requirements as well. And so these are some of the ideas and nuances that we included or paid attention to in the guidebook as well, in addition to what we've heard here. But overall, they were validating to the experiences and expertise that we've heard in this room as well. And that's all I have for now. Paulina, did you want to add anything?
No, thanks. I just want to say we'll see these ideas coming up in those key considerations, but also those best practices. And I think it was really helpful to hear from users of the code that there's support and there's this alignment between potentially looking at new ways to do things as you go through that compliance, considering potentially going a little bit further or trying a new approach. So there's a lot of support and clarity around those built outcomes. So I just want to turn us now to some discussion in looking at all the resources that we provided. I would say, does anybody have any questions about what the resources are? Or could we clarify any of the tools that you'll have at your disposal? Maybe just I'll start us out as a softball question. Is there a resource here that seems like it's going to be the most helpful as you go through your process? Yeah, certainly.
I've got to unmute myself. I really like the fact that it has both clear model code and how to think beyond that. Different jurisdictions really need different types of help. And the how to go beyond it, I think, is super useful for jurisdictions that need a little more, but don't necessarily have a large planning staff. So I think that's great.
Great. Anybody else think there's a particularly helpful aspect of the tools that are presented as you're thinking through how to update your codes? On the flip side of that, I think as you're looking at the tools, are there any tools that are falling short for you? You're not quite sure how to use that tool, or maybe there's some way that tool could be modified to better support your needs. Do people feel that the different parts of the guidebook, having walked through those, do you feel that the guidebook sets you up for success in reviewing and updating your code? Does it set your consultants up, if you happen to have them, for success to look through the different parts of your code? Skylar.
Yeah, I think everything you've laid out is really clear, and particularly the model code part of the guidebook. I guess my question, and maybe this is out of the scope of the CFEC 330 and also like your scope on this, but the land use side of things is only one component of the built environment in the area that we're talking about, and it gets into engineering standards as well. And while I really appreciate the model code, I wonder if there's an opportunity to add in some information, even at a high level, about how to, bring code, additional considerations in bringing your engineering standards into concordance with the model code, because I can imagine that there's going to be a lot of circumstances where these things might be in conflict. So, one example, driveway spacing standards or placement of infrastructure in the right of way or encroachments, because that's, from a practitioner standpoint, always like the kind of tough sell, I guess, is the way I would put it, is the engineering folks. And so it feels like it would be helpful to us, and I'm interested in if others think this as well, to have at least, maybe if nothing else, even talking points, but something that helps to navigate those conversations, I think would be helpful.
Yeah, does anyone else agree with Skylar or want to add more to that point? Yeah, Sarli.
I think it's particularly important when possibly your jurisdiction does not provide most of the roads. So if you're a small city and the county provides the roads, then it gets even harder, because you basically do not have any control over the right of way, or at least parts of the right of way. So having help with that as you're trying to get something on the private side that works with the public side, I think that would help a lot.
Yeah, this goes to the thing I was mentioning earlier about, we're all fairly holistic planners based on getting to know you all through this process. And it's challenging to be a holistic planner and having to think, with land use only blinders on, when so much of the success of walkability is also tied up in the quality of the public realm streets. And there's obvious interface between them right at this, the edges that we're talking about, right at the and so while this is a land use effort, I just want to acknowledge that, we're tackling only one side of an important coin. And I'd invite, I guess, maybe DLCD, I see a hand, but I'd invite DLCD maybe to sort of articulate the grander vision related to the CFEC program, and how, some of those transportation related considerations could be tackled in the course of other planning efforts like a TSP, and how those things can kind of dovetail together with the walkable design standards, if you have any thoughts.
I don't have deep thoughts on it, other than clearly the transportation system plans is going to set much the same problem that Skylar mentioned. Is like we're going to have some, handoff at some point between the planning documents and then the, public works standards. So I think within scope of this project, I think it's a really good idea to at least have a call out box and maybe some talking points and key considerations to think about, that, how to kind of go further and activate the plans, who you might look to talk to within your city. But I don't know that we're going to get down into that depth of the engineering standards, because that probably is handled much differently in every city across the state. And then we have a lot of different folks that we need to consult with, but definitely a really good consideration. Kevin, did you want to add anything?
No, I have a lot of opinions on this topic, but it's a challenging realm. I know there's a huge brain trust in this room, in this virtual room, about things that work well in terms of street design standards and things that don't work well. If there's some opportunity to use some of that energy separately, to just sort of crowdsource, like, hey, here's something that we're doing in our downtown. It works well for, pedestrian ease of travel or whatever. That's a thought. I'm not asking the consultants to do it. It's not in their scope. But I think the point made is absolutely critical. I mean, we're talking about walkable communities. Where do people walk? Well, a lot of times it's within the right of way. So those standards are important. I'll put a pin in that one for now, but excellent point.
I think
Really quick, before we jump to Derek, I just want to call out, the city of Hillsborough, we're doing a code audit for them right now, and as sort of calling them out for best practice, not only in also in engineering standards related code audit, service of housing frequency, and so a holistic approach from the get-go. Don't let our focus only on land use here prevent you, resources allowing, from considering a process that allows you to tackle some of those things in parallel with wrestling some of these questions. I'm sorry, Derek, you've had your hand up for quite a while. So
well, just to emphasize what Skylar said, we have a zone in our code that specifically has 9 to 12 feet as a driveway width, which is straight out of the model code here. And our engineering department has said that's physically impossible for a vehicle to navigate, and refuse to go with what's been in our code for 30 years. My home driveway is 8 feet wide. It's been that way for 50 years, and I've never had a problem getting in and out. So, so I agree with everything Skylar said.
I think a lot of the intent here is to slowly arm you with tools to move incrementally forward, and that bigger lens to work across departments and to try to push it to go a little bit further. So 8-foot driveways work all the time. And each jurisdiction is going to have different overlap and different amounts of coordination with their public works or other engineering standards. And I think our hope would be here first drawing those lines in the model code so that we're, often it's not as clearly stated in the land use regulations, those references to the engineering standards. But so we wanted to put that really clearly here, right? Include those driveway standards so that they're not in some engineering standard out of the way, they're front and center. So that forces that conversation, a potential to maybe think about it differently. And then I also think in those resources, those appendices, we want to include, part of that would be arming you with information to that end. So, street types and street design manuals and references that DLCD has worked on, for decades. And you all know that information, but it's in there and it's all contained in one resource. So it's easy to point to it and try to move other folks along. So it is a constraint, but it's also an opportunity to maybe start to tackle it every opportunity that we do have to do that. Sorry, Phil, go ahead.
Thanks. I was just going to follow up because I think Skylar does make a good point. And, I was noticing and reviewing some of the stuff, there's some places where we do have provisions where you defer to the city engineer or the jurisdiction engineer. But there's also, some standards there related to driveways or related to, driveway placement on the local service street and stuff that maybe it might be problematic on certain sites. And I was wondering, is that something that this code should, go to bat on in terms of, if it creates a large sort of disagreement and argument that threatens, the ability for a jurisdiction to get the model code or similar thing in place? Is there some point where, you kind of let that part go so you can get the other good design elements in place, or is it something where it's just going to have to get hammered out and that could delay the implementation? I was wondering if there's some sort of way to kind of have a mediation option.
Yeah, I'm going to defer that question to DLCD. I think that's a thoughtful question, Phil.
I mean, I just want to relate, and when we're updating the transportation system plans, we're expecting to see, that's where you're going to see your street standards and your right-of-way standards and your cross sections. And I was a little bit kind of reading Anne's chat here, so I hope my question is on point with Phil's question. But I was just thinking about this and going, like, we are going to be talking about that and handling a lot of that stuff in the TSP. I don't know that we get to all of it, but Phil, am I answering your question?
Yeah, I think so. There's probably just a timing aspect potentially between these. I don't want necessarily, there's a lot of good aspects to this. And so I wouldn't want something to get held up just because of one disagreement on a driveway placement or whether a width can be 9 or 12 feet.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that some of that will be on a case-by-case basis on your particular city and your relationship with the engineering department and some of the clearly, the safety considerations that they're putting into some of the stuff. So.
Yeah, no, I guess I'll just add, I think Cody's point is a good one, is that, recognize we're moving into a new paradigm where the TPR is asking us to consider more strongly the needs of pedestrians, bicyclists, and other users. What that means in future TSPs, we can't say precisely, but that is baked in to the rules. But I think, Phil, to your point, how soon that hits at the local level is gonna vary. So it's a challenging issue. I've struggled with it through my entire career, reconciling engineering and planning goals. But I could talk all day on this.
And just, I guess the final word here is the TBR does go a little bit further into some of the standards on some of the bicycle rules under Rule 610, which kind of says, hey, really look at designing facilities that are low stress, comfortable for all ages and abilities, and kind of flag out like using the NACTO, National Association of Transportation, City County Transportation Officials guidance on doing some of that work. So I do expect that cities will kind of push a little farther on making sure that the right of ways are supporting the land use element, right? Like we're designing the cities to be walkable and pleasant to be in, but we got to make sure that we're having a supportive transportation system, as Kevin said, to meet that. But clearly more work to come.
Great. Well, maybe Tara or Alex, I would ask you if there's anything to highlight from the chat. I haven't been able to look at that as well, but any other thoughts or comments about the resources that are being provided that you could point us to in the chat?
I'm not seeing anything immediately that hasn't been discussed, but for those who are dropping stuff in, if you don't feel like your comment has been addressed in the conversation or you'd like to bring it up now, we have a little bit of time, and if we don't have anything else to talk about, we can certainly give everyone 15 minutes back. But anyone dropped anything in the chat that they feel like they want to daylight?
I was just gonna say, I think it reflects an immense amount of work, and I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Eunice. I think we also recognize there'll be an immense amount of work on the part of cities to work through all this, but also it gives us a real sense of excitement. Code can often be dredge work, but I have to say each one of the standards that we've written about, I find incredibly exciting and interesting, and the possibility to try new and different things and find ways to partner and work with your elected officials and community and other agencies to try to move that along. I think we're hopeful that we can give you as many resources as possible and arm you for that effort. Ryan, did you want to jump in?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I agree. This is really cool. I appreciate the effort that you guys have put in, and I think it's looking really, really good and helpful. I just kind of have a broader question, I guess. And maybe this has been spoken to already and I missed it, so I'm sorry, but just kind of locally here in Corvallis, I think our code is already in a pretty good spot in terms of compliance with 330 kind of goals and objectives. So I don't think we will need to do a lot of work when it comes time to update our TSP to bring our code into compliance with where it needs to be. But I could imagine maybe some jurisdictions will need to do some work, and they'll get some questions from decision makers on, how much is enough to be in compliance with 330. If your code is 80%, is that good enough? Does it need to be 85%? Does it need to be 90%? With these model code standards, and so I don't know if there's going to be some little discussion in this document that speaks to that, like, how far do you need to go to be kind of the minimally compliant? I think all of us in this virtual room would be fine being 100% compliant and going, for the max, but there may be pushback from decision makers and questions as to how far do we really need to go as a minimum. So just curious about that.
It's kind of a question for DLCD, but I mean, just philosophically, our approach here is laying out a process that invites a critical thinking exercise and also acknowledges the wide variation from the cities that are applicable. And so our intention was not to anticipate a right answer, but to encourage a thoughtful process and to provide resources that can help, kind of enhance and augment that conversation locally. But Kevin and Cody, invite you to weigh in as well.
I don't think we can precisely say what these thresholds are. That's a good question, Ryan. And we intentionally did not want to create like a minimum bar. What we're trying to do here is best practices. I think jurisdictions can be confident if they adopt the model code, if they follow this formula, they will be compliant. You know, in many of the standards in the model code, we've got ranges. If they're within those ranges, they're going to be great. If they're not, I don't know, you know, ultimately, you know, where the rubber hits the road on, I don't know, you know, just different standards. I mean, at a minimum, I would think your findings would need to reflect like, okay, here's the pieces of 330 and here's where they're addressed in our code, or here's the conversations we had about that issue. This is where we landed, that type of thing. I don't know if that really helps, but all I can say at this point.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know it's a tough question to provide a real solid answer to, but it's kind of something that's been swimming around in my head. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to pause and see if anybody else has a question or clarification you need or a point that you want to make. Phil.
So I was holding off possibly. I didn't know if we're getting towards the end of the meeting or not. I just wanted to check because I looked through the model code and I did have some like more specific questions that I thought would be maybe better to just send off to some folks, or maybe take the code and throw the questions in there. Is that something I would just send to you, Pauline and Alex, perhaps, or?
Yeah, I have a slide I've created just for you, Phil, and I had a feeling you might have some detailed comments, so I appreciate that. I'll walk us through sort of where we're headed big picture, but more immediately, yes, we would love any feedback on those draft model code or the draft building types. That could be anything from an email. And yeah, that'd be great if you send it to me and to Alex, and I'll get it to our whole team. That could be an email with some thoughts, higher level, or if you want to redline and work through that draft model code and raise some problematic questions, that is absolutely wonderful as well. So we have gone through one round of review with DLCD. We have their sets of comments, and we're going to take those comments along with any from our TAC and work to see how we can reconcile them. Oftentimes, it's going to be hard to make a decision one way or the other. And so those are also the types of elements that will reflect in those key considerations that we write up for people. But yeah, really appreciate, it's pretty unique to have so many skilled code reviewers and writers in one TAC. So any thoughts that you have? So I have this deadline up here, and this gets more to this bigger picture. So if you have the availability to get those to us by next Friday, September 20th, either by email or with those comments, that would be amazing. Now, that's fast, and part of the reason for that is we are seeking today, having walked you through our approach to compliance and the tools, we're going to get to work and we're going to start drafting all that up for you, but it is a lot of content. And we're seeking to get that to you ready for review in early October. And we're also going to take advantage of OAPA conference and present at the same time that draft walkable design guidebook to that larger group of statewide planners and see any thoughts that they have, key points they want to raise with us, considerations we could add in. So given that early October deadline, it'd be really helpful if you have the ability to get us comments on either of those tools by the end of next week. So we'll get your feedback. We'll get feedback from DLCD. We'll work on a refined draft number 2 of the model code, and that's what will be included in the draft walkable design guidebook that you all see, and that's presented to the public. And then after a final round of edits, we'll have that final walkable design standards guidebook ready in late fall, which should support those of you who are starting that first round of implementation, and then any future projects that come after that that are implementing it. So did anybody have any questions about any of that?
Pauline, I just want to emphasize we
Great.
have a session at the OAPA in October. And that's really our target date to get the word out for the public review draft. So all the great comments you all put in here, we hope to get a good public draft available and use that opportunity to, get all the planners in one spot and really push out, getting more people to look at it and comment. It's something we're doing for the CFEC jurisdictions who are subject to that, but we don't see it as a resource that's limited to that. So we really hoping on kind of building on this guidebook to help kind of bring up the bar of planning for all our cities in the state. So that's and I want to thank Phil and Skylar and Pauline and Kevin, and the session will be moderated by Laura Buell from DLCD, who's done a fair amount of walkable design work over her career here at DLCD for the TGM Code Assistance Program. So should be a good session. Hope to see folks there.
So we'll follow up after this meeting, make sure everybody knows how to access that, and give you an easy email that you can reply to send us back your thoughts or your edits. And so that review, along with one final review of the Walkable Design Guidebook, and your duty here will be done. We really appreciate you being present and all the thought that you've put into this, and hopefully you see that reflected in the guidebook content. So really, your participation has made it the resource that it's going to be. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and thank you all and release you from class early. So thanks so much.
Thanks.